The day Della Thatcher buried her husband, she made herself a promise that she would never say his name aloud again, because the sound of it on her own lips was more than her heart could bear. That was 14 months ago, and she had kept that promise through every gray dawn and every long, aching night on the homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878. She had kept it through the neighbors who came with their casserole dishes and their sorrowful eyes, through her mother-in-law's letters that arrived from Ohio every other week, through the moments when she nearly broke and called out to him from habit, standing at the stove, reaching for the coffee pot, watching the sun go down over the flat, golden plain. She had closed his name up inside herself like a letter sealed and never sent, and she had gone on living because there was the land to tend and the cattle to keep, and because going on was the only thing left that made any sense at all. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town at the edge of everything. It sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, and the Kishom Trail ran through it like a vein of copper ore through limestone, valuable, visible, and the reason for nearly every transaction that took place in town. Cowboys drove longhorns north from Texas through the summer months, and the town filled with dust and noise and men who smelled of horse and sweat and were desperate for a hot meal and a soft bed. By October, the herds had mostly come and gone, and Caldwell settled back into the quieter rhythm of its permanent residents. The merchants, the families, the farmers trying to make something permanent out of ground that had no particular interest in permanence. Della was 31 years old. She had brown hair the color of good earth and gray eyes that people had always described as serious, though her husband had called them honest, which she had preferred. She was not a soft woman, not in the way the word is sometimes meant to indicate weakness. She was capable and precise and stubborn in the particular way that the frontier required of its women. She could ride and mend fence and slaughter a hog and keep financial records and negotiate at the feed store. And she had done all of these things in the 14 months since the burial without asking a single soul for help. The homestead was 160 acres, a house, a barn, 4 cows, a vegetable patch, 2 horses, and a debt at the Caldwell Savings and Loan that had another 2 years to run. Her husband, Thomas Thatcher, had died of a fever that moved from his lungs to his blood in the space of 4 days, and the doctor had been honest about the fact that there had been nothing to be done. Thomas had been 34. He had been a good man. He had built the barn with his own hands, and she still could not walk through it without seeing those hands in every nail and joint. She did not speak his name. She called him my husband when she had to reference him at all, and most people in Caldwell understood well enough not to press her. Margaret Olson at the general store would occasionally lay a hand on Della's arm and say, "How are you keeping, honey?" in a tone that contained the whole question inside it, and Della would say, "Well enough, thank you," and that would be the end of it. She had built a life that worked without the name. She had convinced herself on most days that this was surviving. On the harder days, she suspected it was only a very convincing imitation of it. The stranger arrived in Caldwell on the 14th of October, 1878, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the kind of pale blue that looks like it has been rinsed clean by the previous night's cold. He came in on a chestnut roan that had clearly had a hard several days of it, walking with the careful deliberateness of a horse that is tired but too well trained to show it fully. The man on its back was tall even in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn canvas duster the color of dried grass, with a hat that had seen considerable weather. He had a bedroll and a pair of saddlebags, and the kind of face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors deciding things. His name was Peter Wallace, and he was 33 years old, and he had been riding north from Texas for 6 weeks with no particular destination in mind beyond the general direction of away. He was not a drifter in the romantic sense of the word. He had, until 8 months ago, owned a small cattle operation down in Cook County, Texas, with his brother James. But James had decided to sell his half of the stake and move his family to Denver, and Peter had done the arithmetic on running the place alone and found that it did not add up to anything he wanted to spend the rest of his life on. He had sold his half too, paid off what was owed, and ridden north because north felt as good as any other direction. He was not a man who spoke much without reason, and he was not a man who made friends quickly, though once he did, those friendships tended to be the kind that lasted. He had a dry sense of humor that people sometimes took a beat to catch. He was honest to a fault. His brother had called it his finest quality and his most aggravating one in the same breath. He could read well, which was not universal on the frontier, and he had a habit of pulling out a battered copy of whatever book he was working through whenever he had 15 minutes without something urgent demanding his attention. He rode into Caldwell that October morning because his horse needed shoes, and he needed a real meal and a night under a solid roof, and because Caldwell was the next town on the road he was riding. That was the whole of the intention. He had no idea that the town contained a woman with gray eyes who had not spoken her husband's name in 14 months, and she had no idea the town was about to contain him. He stopped first at the livery on the south end of Main Street, where a boy of about 12 took the reins of his horse with the practiced confidence of someone who had been doing it since he could walk. Peter paid for a stall and for the shoeing and asked for the horse to have an extra ration of grain, and the boy said he would see to it personally with the gravity of a bank president. The saloon was across the street from the livery, but Peter had never been a man with much interest in whiskey before noon, so he walked up the street toward the general store instead, the duster settling around him in the light morning wind. Della Thatcher came out of the general store at the precise moment that Peter Wallace reached the door of it, and they nearly collided on the wooden sidewalk because she was looking back over her shoulder at Margaret Olson, who had called something after her, and he was looking at the sign above the door to make sure he had the right building. She caught herself against the doorframe. He stepped back quickly. "Pardon me," he said. He had a Texas drawl that was not thick but was present. The vowels stretched just slightly at the edges. "My fault," she said, because it was, though she was already moving past it in her mind, cataloging what she had in her arms: the sack of flour, the tin of coffee, the package of salt she had nearly dropped. She looked up then because he had not moved entirely out of her path, and she got a proper look at him. He was looking at her with the same neutral, assessing look that she imagined she was giving him, the frontier habit of measuring a stranger quickly and cleanly, not rudely, but out of a lifetime of understanding that strangers required assessment. "No harm done," he said, and held the door open for her to pass back through if she needed to, or for him to enter, whichever came first. "I'm finished," she said, and stepped down off the sidewalk. "Store's all yours." She walked back to her wagon, which was hitched at the post 20 feet away. She loaded her supplies into the back, untied the horse, climbed up to the seat, and drove back out of town without looking back at the door of the general store, because there was no reason to look back. She did not think about him for the rest of that day. She thought about the fence line on the north side of her property, which had a section that was leaning toward failure. She thought about the debt payment that was due in 3 weeks, and whether the sale of 2 of the cows at the autumn market would cover it with enough left over to get through winter. She thought about the roof of the barn, where she had noticed a gap in the shingles during the last rain. She thought about the letter from Thomas's mother that was sitting on the kitchen table, unopened, because she was not yet ready to read it. She did not think about the stranger with the canvas duster. Peter Wallace had a meal at the small restaurant on Main Street: beans, salt pork, cornbread, and coffee that was strong enough to make his eyes water, which he considered a compliment to the cook. He paid for a room at the Caldwell Hotel, which was a 2-story frame building that was somewhat more optimistic in its naming than in its execution. But the bed was clean, and the room was warm, and he had slept in considerably worse. He spent the afternoon reading on the hotel's small front porch, watching Caldwell conduct its business. It was a town with a particular energy to it even in the off-season. The presence of the trail still humming in the air, the sense that things moved through here, that this was a place of transition. He had read about Caldwell in a newspaper some months back, an article about the tensions between the cattle trade and the settling farmers, which was a story playing out all across Kansas at that time. The homesteaders wanted fences and grain, and the cattle operations wanted open range and clear passage, and the two desires were not naturally compatible, and the friction between them was sometimes resolved peacefully at the county commission and sometimes not. He had not decided whether to stay more than a night or two. He had no compelling reason to stay, and no compelling reason to leave, which was the peculiar condition of a man without obligations, and which he was still learning to navigate. The autumn market came to Caldwell every year in the third week of October, which was 3 days after Peter Wallace arrived. It was not the great cattle sales of the summer months, but it was a significant event for the surrounding farms and homesteads, a chance to sell livestock and surplus grain and trade goods, and to see people you had not seen since spring. The town filled up with wagons, and the particular noise of animals being moved and assessed and argued over, and the air smelled of hay and wood smoke and frying meat from the vendors along the main street. Della came in early on the first morning of the market with her 2 cows and her horse, and a crate of preserved goods she had been putting up since August. She had her hair pinned back and was wearing her good wool coat, dark blue, which Thomas had given her their second Christmas, and which still fit her exactly as it had then. She had her financial ledger in her bag and her determination set firmly in place, and she intended to conduct her business cleanly and be back on the road to the homestead before noon. She sold the cows to a rancher from Sumner County for a fair price. She knew enough to negotiate and was not shy about it, which the rancher seemed to take as a mild surprise, though she had no interest in his surprise. She sold most of the preserved goods to a family from a neighboring homestead who had had a rough season with their garden and needed the supplies. She was in the middle of tallying her ledger at the edge of the market, standing at her wagon, when she heard a familiar voice. "The fence wire on the north end is your best deal today." It was Pete Haskins, who ran the hardware table at the market every year, and he was talking to someone on the other side of the wagon. "How much per roll?" The second voice was the one she recognized a beat later, not because she had heard it many times, but because it had a quality that was specific, that Texas-touched, measured drawl. The stranger from the general store. She did not lean around the side of the wagon to confirm it. She finished her numbers and closed the ledger, but then Pete Haskins said, "You settling nearby, friend?" "That's a fair amount of wire for a man just passing through," and the voice said, "Not decided yet," and Pete said, "Well, you could do worse than Caldwell," and there was a small pause, and then the voice said, "I'm starting to think that might be true." Della picked up her bag and her ledger and walked around the front of the wagon to unhitch her horse, and she came around the corner, and there he was, 3 feet away, in the same canvas duster, holding a roll of fence wire in each hand and looking at 2 more on the table. He looked up when she appeared, and there was a brief moment of mutual recognition that passed between them without commentary. "Good morning," she said, because it was the polite thing and because she was not a woman who pretended not to see people. "Good morning," he said. He set one of the rolls down. "We keep running into each other." "Small town," she said. "I'm Peter Wallace," he said. He said it simply, without performance, the way someone says their name when they think you might actually want to know it. She looked at him for a moment. His eyes were a particular shade of dark brown, she noticed, like the inside of a walnut shell. He was not looking at her with the pitying calculation she sometimes saw in the eyes of unmarried men when they looked at a widow with land. He was looking at her the way you look at someone you're having a conversation with, which was, in its own way, a relief. "Della Thatcher," she said. He nodded, no further ceremony about it. "You're buying fence wire," she said, because it was evident. "Need to repair something if I'm going to stay," he said. "Staying where?" "There's a parcel of land on Elm Creek Road," he said. "The Harmon Place. I spoke to the bank yesterday. The property has been sitting empty since the family moved on." She knew the Harmon Place. It was about 3 miles from her own homestead, east along the same creek road. The house was in moderate repair but had not been occupied in 2 years, and the fencing had gone largely to pieces. It was a workable property if someone was willing to put work into it. "That's a project," she said. "I have time," he said. There was something in how he said it, not resigned exactly, but carrying a weight that she recognized the shape of because she had carried a version of it herself. The weight of time that has been emptied of what it used to be full of. She did not say this to him. She was not in the habit of naming things she had only observed in passing. "Good luck with the wire," she said, and led her horse to the road. She drove home that afternoon with the debt payment in her bag and the rest of the preserved goods money set aside for winter supplies. And she thought, briefly, about the Harmon Place and what it would mean to have a neighbor on that road again. She had been the only person on Elm Creek Road for 14 months, and she had grown accustomed to the solitude, and she was not sure whether the prospect of a neighbor was welcome or not. She put the thought away with the same efficiency she applied to most things, and went inside to read her mother-in-law's letter. The letter was from Ruth Thatcher, who was 62 years old and still living in the house in Chillicothe, Ohio, where Thomas had grown up. Ruth wrote every 2 weeks without fail. Her letters were full of practical information: the weather in Ohio, the health of the neighbors, the progress of the church building fund, and laced throughout with a careful, patient love for her daughter-in-law that Della felt every time she read them, even when she could not quite receive it properly. Ruth never pressed. She never suggested Della was grieving incorrectly, or too long or not enough. She wrote about Thomas sometimes, always with my son. And Della read those passages carefully and let herself feel what they made her feel, and then folded the letter and put it in the box with the others and went back to living. This letter mentioned that Ruth was thinking of visiting in the spring, if Della could accommodate her, and Della sat at the kitchen table for a long while after she read that, in the lamplight, with the October wind moving along the sides of the house, and felt something shift in her chest, something that might have been anticipation. Ruth's visits were warm and practical and full of good cooking and honest conversation, and Della wrote back that same night to say, "Yes, please come, the guest room will be waiting." Peter Wallace signed the papers on the Harmon Place on October 22nd. He paid down 3 months in advance to secure the lease, and the banker, a careful man named Grady who wore wire-rimmed glasses and seemed genuinely surprised when anyone actually wanted to farm, shook his hand with a look that mingled approval with mild concern. The property was, as Della had assessed from a distance, a project. The house was solid, the Harmon family had built well, but the windows needed new glazing and the chimney wanted repointing, and the front door had warped in its frame so that it would only close if you lifted it slightly and then pushed. The outbuildings were in varying states of use, and the fencing was as bad as he had expected. He spent the first week making the house livable, and the second week starting on the fence. He worked alone and efficiently, and was not the kind of man to be discouraged by the size of a job when he had the means and the will to do it. He had purchased his supplies at Haskins's Hardware, asked questions of the livery owner about the local conditions, and introduced himself properly to the few permanent residents of Elm Creek Road, which turned out to be 3 farm families plus a cattle operation at the far eastern end, plus the woman at the Thatcher homestead, which was the property he passed every time he rode to and from town. He had not stopped at the Thatcher homestead, because she had not invited him to, and he was not the kind of man who inserted himself into other people's lives without being asked. He saw the place as he rode past. It was a well-kept operation, the house recently whitewashed, the garden put to bed for winter with the sort of methodical care that came from someone who knew what they were doing. Twice he saw her at the fence line as he passed, working at something, and he raised a hand and she raised one back, and that was the whole of it. On the 5th day of November, which was a Monday, Della was coming back from the creek with a bucket of water. Her pump had frozen for the first time that season, which was earlier than usual and a nuisance, and she found Peter Wallace at her gate. He was not inside the gate. He was standing at it with one of his horses and a small wrapped parcel, and he had the particular posture of a man who has not yet decided whether he is going to knock or not. She stopped and looked at him. "I went to town this morning," he said. "Haskins had a new shipment come in. He had pump seals in the lot. I noticed your pump last time I passed." She looked at the parcel. "I don't want charity," she said. She said it without heat, which took some effort because she meant it, and the effort was in saying it clearly without making it unfriendly. "It's not charity," he said. "You can pay me back at cost, or in kind if that's easier. I have a chimney that needs repointing and I don't have the skill for it." She looked at him for a long moment. His expression was patient and carried no trace of condescension, and the offer was structured in a way that she recognized as respect, a trade, not a gift. A trade was something different entirely. "Come in," she said. She fixed the pump herself while he watched, because she wanted to understand the repair so she could do it again if she needed to. And he answered her questions about the mechanism without making her feel as though the questions were unnecessary. He was good at that, she would come to realize later, at giving information without making you feel diminished for needing it. Afterward, she made coffee, because it was cold and they had both been working outdoors, and it was the hospitable thing to do, and they sat at the kitchen table across from each other while the wind came down from the north and pressed at the windows. "Where did you come from?" she asked, because she had been curious. In the peripheral way she was curious about most things, and because she was alone enough that conversation with another adult felt like something worth the effort. "Cook County, Texas," he said. "Originally, I'm from Missouri. My family had a farm in Saline County." "What brought you to Texas?" "My brother had the idea of it," he said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands the way people do when they are deciding how much of a thing to say. "We ran cattle together for 5 years. He decided to go north to Colorado with his family, and I went a different direction." "Do you have family other than your brother?" "Parents are gone. Brother and his wife and their 3 children up in Denver now." He paused. "And yourself?" "You're running this place alone." 14 months, she said. "That's hard work," he said, not with pity, with the plain acknowledgement of a person who understood what hard work was. "You get used to what you have to," she said. "You do," he agreed, and said it with that same undertone of weight that she had heard at the market, and she looked at him directly and he looked back, and neither of them said anything more about it for the time being. He came back 10 days later with the chimney question. She went to the Harmon place. His place. She was starting to think of it with her trowel and mortar mix, and spent an afternoon repointing the joints while he handed tools and held materials, and made her lunch from what he had, which was a reasonable pot of beans with salt pork and biscuits that were not quite right, but were clearly the product of honest effort. "These aren't terrible," she said, eating one. "I know they're not right," he said. "I cannot quite get the proportion. Too much baking powder," she said, "and you need to work the dough less." "My mother would be embarrassed," he said. He said it lightly, but there was something in it. "She taught you?" Della asked. "She tried," he said. "I was a stubborn student." They worked through the afternoon, and she showed him the biscuit proportion before she left, standing in his kitchen with flour on her hands, and the last of the afternoon light coming through the newly glazed window. And he watched carefully and tried it himself and got a better result. And the small satisfaction on his face when he bit into the test biscuit was so unguarded and genuine that she found herself smiling before she had thought about it. She rode home in the early dusk and noticed that she had not thought about the debt or the fence or the roof for most of the afternoon, and this was unusual enough that she noticed it. November moved into December, and the northern Kansas winter settled in with its full weight. The prairie went pale and still, and the sky turned the flat white of an old bone, and the creek froze enough to bear a person's weight by the second week of December. The cold was the working kind, not dramatically dangerous in the way of the severe blizzards that sometimes swept through, but constant and requiring attention, the kind of cold that means you do not stop moving between chores or you will get stiff and slow, and then you will make mistakes. Peter proved to be a practical neighbor. He did not insert himself, but when he was available and something needed 2 pairs of hands, he appeared. When her water trough froze solid one morning and she was breaking it with an axe, he stopped on his way to town and broke it the rest of the way. And when one of her horses threw a shoe on a cold afternoon and she was leading it back to the barn, he appeared on the road and led the horse while she checked its foot. And when the section of fence she had been worried about finally gave way in a December wind, he was there the next morning with wire and posts before she had finished her breakfast. She returned these things. She helped him learn the particular tempers of the Harmon property, where the ground froze hardest, where the drainage went wrong in wet weather, which of the stall hinges would stick in cold weather. She brought food sometimes, because she was cooking for one and had long since learned to cook as though she were cooking for 2 out of habit, and a man doing a full day's outdoor work in December needed more than what a bachelor kitchen usually produced. She left things at his gate rather than knocking, usually, and he would return the dishes clean, and sometimes with a note, a word of thanks or a question about a piece of equipment, or once, a small clipping from a newspaper about a new variety of winter wheat that he had thought she might find useful. She put the clipping in her ledger because it was useful. The notes were not romantic in nature. They were friendly and specific, and communicated the easy, matter-of-fact quality of 2 people who were developing a working relationship on the frontier, where pragmatic mutual support was not sentiment but survival. She knew this and she appreciated it, and she did not assign it a meaning it was not yet carrying. But she did find, as December wore on, that she thought about him more than she thought about the fence or the debt or the roof, which was a development she observed without yet naming. The first time she was in his house long enough to look around properly was in the 3rd week of December, when a heavy snowstorm came in over 2 days and made movement between the properties impractical. He had ridden over before the worst of it hit to help her bring extra feed into the barn, and then the storm came in faster than expected, and he was there for the duration of it. She was not discomfited by this. She had been raised in the practical understanding that weather on the frontier did not accommodate social propriety, and he was not the kind of man who made her feel as though she needed to be discomfited. He was careful with her space, and he was good company in the particular way that quiet, honest people are good company. He did not fill the silence unnecessarily, but when he spoke, it was worth listening to. They played cards that first evening, a game of cribbage she had taught him, because he did not know it and she had found that she enjoyed teaching it. He was quick to learn and had a natural feel for the strategy of it, which she told him, and he said he had always liked problems with rules because at least you knew the shape of what you were working with, which she thought was an interesting way to describe it. They talked for a long time that night, longer than she had talked with anyone in many months, the kind of talking that ranges across subjects without plan. The town, the territory, the land, the new barbed wire fencing that was changing the cattle drives, the question of statehood for the territories, a book he had been reading about the surveying of the Western territories, her thoughts about expanding her vegetable garden in the spring. It was effortless in the particular way that effortless conversation is actually the product of 2 people who are paying attention. At some point she became aware that the lamp had burned low and that outside the window the world was utterly white and silent, and that she was warm and comfortable in a way she had not been in a long time, and that she was happy, and that this realization arrived with a complicated undercoat of feeling. She thought about Thomas, who had always been the warmth in a room. Not because the room was cold without Peter. It was not, but because happiness had been so long connected to Thomas in her mind that feeling it now was like touching something tender, something that was healing but was not yet fully healed. She said good night and went upstairs to the room she always occupied when weather kept her over, which had a patchwork quilt and a small window that looked out over the snowed-in yard, and she lay in the dark and thought about things she had not thought about in 14 months. Christmas came quietly. Caldwell marked it with a church service and a community dinner that was held in the church hall, and the whole of the surrounding community came in for it despite the cold, because this was how the isolation was managed, by gathering at fixed points in the calendar and filling up the common space with warmth and sound. Della went, wearing the blue coat. She had made a pie to bring, the dried apple kind, which had been Thomas's favorite and which she had not made since before his illness, and which she had made this year without entirely knowing why until she was finishing the crust and realized it was because she was ready too. Peter was there, near the back of the hall, looking somewhat at sea in the social machinery of a community celebration. He was not shy, she had learned by now, but he was new, and newness in a small, tight community requires navigation. She watched him for a moment from across the room, saw him exchange a few words with Pete Haskins and with the Barlow family from the east end of the road, and then she made her way over with 2 plates of food, because it was Christmas, and because he did not yet know the unspoken seating customs of this hall, and was about to make a well-intentioned mistake about where he sat. "Sit here," she said, directing him to the side table that was used by the farmers on the creek road. "That table is for the Grange committee. You'll be there all night." He looked at where he had been heading and looked back at her and said, "Thank you," with a dry undertone that acknowledged he had been about to make exactly the kind of well-intentioned mistake she had predicted. They sat side by side at the Creek Road table, and she introduced him properly to the Barlows, and to the Simmons family, and to old Amos Pickett, who had been on the road longer than anyone and whose opinion of new residents was the benchmark the others used. Amos Pickett looked Peter Wallace over with the slow, thorough assessment of a man who has seen many people come and go, and asked him 3 pointed questions about his Texas cattle experience, and Peter answered them directly and without embellishment, and Amos said, "Good," and went back to his meal, which was Amos's version of a full endorsement. After the dinner, while the tables were being pushed back for dancing, Peter said, "Your pie was the best thing I ate today." "It was Thomas's recipe," she said, and then stopped. It was the closest she had come to his name. She heard the first sound of it in her own voice and felt the familiar locked place in her chest pull tight, the way a scar does when the weather changes. Peter did not press. He said, "It was very good," and left it entirely at her discretion whether more would be said, and she appreciated this more than she could have articulated. She danced twice that night, once with old Amos, who was a surprisingly good dancer for a man of 70, and who required it of anyone who sat at his table at the Christmas dinner, and once with Peter, because he asked, and because she wanted to, and because it was Christmas and she had eaten Thomas's pie, and she thought that perhaps allowing herself one thing at a time was how you found your way back to the world. He was not a particularly polished dancer, but he was steady and attentive and kept to her pace when she led the direction, and his hand was warm at her waist through the wool of her coat, and she looked at the middle of his chest rather than his face for most of the dance. But toward the end she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that was careful and warm, and held something in it that she recognized, and was not yet ready to meet directly. She looked back at the middle of his chest. He did not press. January was ferocious. Kansas in January can be a spectacular cruelty. The wind comes across the flat land with no obstruction, and the temperatures can drop to things that seem designed specifically to remind a person of their physical limitations. Della was experienced with it and had prepared well, but a stretch of 10 days in mid-January was the worst she had seen since the winter of 1874. The kind of cold that killed livestock and froze pipes solid, and made the very act of crossing a yard from the house to the barn a negotiation with the weather. She and Peter had, by this point, an established pattern of checking on each other during severe weather, a visual signal, agreed on in December, that functioned as a welfare check. A lamp in the east-facing window meant all was well. No lamp meant it was not. They had agreed on this in a practical way, the same way they had agreed on most things, without excessive sentiment. On the fourth day of the terrible cold, the lamp was not in her window when he looked for it at his usual evening check. He was on his horse and riding through the dark and the teeth of the wind without giving it much analysis, because that was who Peter Wallace was, a man who moved toward problems rather than waiting to see if they resolved themselves. He found her at the barn. She had been treating a sick cow and had been delayed and had not thought about the lamp. And when he appeared in the barn doorway with his face white with cold, and the particular expression of a man who has been genuinely frightened and will not say so directly, she straightened up from where she was crouched at the cow's side and looked at him, and felt something move through her that was wholly unwelcome in its clarity. She was glad he had come, not just in the practical sense, in the personal sense, in the sense that the specific person who had come was the person she was glad to see. She turned back to the cow. "She'll be all right," she said. "It's her foot. I've got it wrapped. She just needs to stay warm." "Do you need help?" "I could use someone to hold the lantern higher," she said. He came in and held the lantern, and they worked on the cow together in the cold barn for the better part of an hour. And when the cow was settled and comfortable, they stood in the barn doorway and looked at the dark frozen yard, and he said, "Come to my place. It's warmer. You've been out here too long." She hesitated. "Della," he said, and the way he said her name, just that, just the name, plain and direct and carrying nothing but care, undid something in her that she had been holding very carefully in place for many weeks. She went with him. They sat by his fire for a long time that night, and she drank the coffee he made, and he told her about the winter, his first year in Texas, which had been bad in a different way, too warm and then too wet, which was almost worse than cold because it sickened the cattle slowly rather than killing them cleanly. And she told him about the winter of 1874, which was the one she measured all other bad winters against. They talked about their families. He told her more about his brother James, about growing up in Missouri with a father who had farmed with the kind of quiet tenacity that came from having no alternative, about a childhood that had been spare but not unhappy. She told him about growing up in Iowa, about her own family, her mother, who had died when she was 19, and her father, who was still alive and living with her sister's family in Des Moines, and who wrote letters that were brief but regular. She told him about coming west with Thomas, about the decision to homestead in Kansas, about what it had been like in the early years when everything was still being built. She did not say Thomas's name. She said my husband, and she said he, and she said we, but she did not say the name, and she was aware of not saying it the way you are aware of a word that is sitting at the back of your tongue. He did not ask. He listened. It was well past midnight when she went home, back through the frozen dark on her horse, and she was warm from the fire and from the conversation, and she thought about him the whole ride back in a way that was no longer peripheral. It was central. He was central. She recognized this with the clarity that came from being an honest person, and she sat with it in the cold dark of her own bedroom and let it be what it was. February came in with a slight relent from the worst of the cold, and with it came a gradual opening up of movement and possibility that felt, in the way springs always feel and February beginnings sometimes feel, like a shift in the nature of things. She invited him to supper one evening, not in exchange for something, not as a practicality, just as an invitation, which was the first time she had done it that clearly. She made a pot roast with the last of the root vegetables from the cellar and bread that came out right, and an apple pudding for dessert. And they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and ate and talked, and after supper he helped her with the dishes, which she did not ask him to, and which he did anyway in the natural, unself-conscious way of someone who is at ease in a space. Afterward they sat by the stove and he asked her carefully, as though the question was important to him that it be asked carefully, "What do you want? For your life, I mean, if everything goes the way you're working toward." She looked at the stove. She had not been asked this question in a long time. She had been asked practical questions. How are you managing? Do you need help? Will you be all right? But not this question, not the one about the future she was actually building. "I want to keep the land," she said. "I want to pay the debt clear and keep the land and run it well. I want to expand the garden and maybe take on another crop in 2 or 3 years." She paused. I would like to not be so alone in it." She said the last part quietly and looked at him when she said it. He held her gaze. He was not a man who looked away from things. "I would like that too," he said, "not to be so alone in it." They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, in the lamplight of her kitchen, with the winter pressing at the walls and the stove clicking with its warmth. And it was one of those moments that is a threshold, and both of them knew it was a threshold. He did not rush through it. She appreciated that. "There is something I need to do first," she said, before anything." "All right," he said. "I'll know it when I've done it," she said, and he nodded, and she believed that he understood what she meant, or close enough. The thing she needed to do was the thing she had been not doing for 14 months. She knew this by the end of February. She had known it for some time, but February made it clear. She was carrying the locked-up name like a stone in her chest, and she had been carrying it because she had believed that if she set it down, she would lose what remained of him, and now she was understanding that this was not how it worked. She was understanding that carrying it sealed and silent was not the same as keeping him, that he was in the barn he built, and the land they had worked together, and the recipe for the pie, and in Ruth's letters, and in her own particular way of looking at a problem, which she had learned partly from him. He was not in the locked-up name. He was in the living she had done since the burial, the hard, stubborn living, and the name was just a word, and the word needed to be said. She wrote to Ruth Thatcher in early March. She wrote a long letter, the longest she had written in years, and in it she wrote things she had been storing up about the land and about the winter and about the neighbor who had become a friend, and about the way she had been carrying the grief, and about what she was beginning to understand about putting it down without putting him down. And at the very end of the letter, she wrote her husband's name, Thomas. She wrote it and she looked at it on the page and she let it be what it was, and she put it in the envelope and sealed it, and she felt something in her chest shift, not break, but shift, the way ice shifts on the creek in early spring, still present but moving again. That was the private moment, the one with the letter. The one that mattered differently was in March, on a morning that was the first genuinely warm morning of the year, when the sky was high and pale blue, and the dried grass was beginning to show the first faint suggestion of green at its roots. Peter had come to help her turn the kitchen garden. She had expanded it, as she had planned, and the turning was a 2-person job on account of the size. They worked through the morning with forks and spades in the newly softened ground, turning the winter over, and the work was good and physical and right for the season. And she was aware of him beside her in a way that was no longer complicated, that was simply clear. At midday they sat on the front steps to eat the sandwiches she had made, and he poured coffee from the tin he had brought, and the sun was actually warm on their faces for the first time in months, and she said, out of nothing particular except the full warm morning and the readiness she had been building toward, "My husband's name was Thomas." She said it. Into the open air, into the morning, to a man who had never heard it from her before. Peter was still. Not with surprise, exactly more with the attention of someone receiving something they understand to be significant. "Thomas," he said, with the simple care of someone saying a word that belongs to someone else. "Thomas Everett Thatcher," she said. "He was a good man, he was kind, and he was funny in a quiet way that you had to be paying attention to catch. He built the barn, he could mend anything mechanical, he liked apple pie, and he could not carry a tune at all." She smiled, and it was a smile that ached but did not break. "He would have liked you, I think." Peter said nothing for a moment. Then, I would have liked to have known him." She breathed out, long and slow, and the locked place in her chest, the one that had been shut for 14 months, opened, not with pain but with something more like relief. Like a room that has been closed too long finally let the outside air in. "I haven't said his name since the burial," she said. "I was afraid to for a long time. I thought if I said it I would, I don't know, lose the last of him. And now," she looked at the garden they had been turning, the dark rich earth exposed and ready. "Now I think I was wrong," she said. "Now I think keeping it inside like that was keeping myself inside too." He looked at her with those walnut-brown eyes, direct and steady and warm, and he said, "I think that's right." "I think I was ready to say it to you," she said, because she was also an honest woman and she was not going to say the thing she had said and then leave the rest of it unspoken. Because of how I feel about you." She said this looking at the garden, not at him. He waited until she looked at him and then he said, "I'm going to say something now and I want you to know I mean it exactly as plainly as it sounds." "All right," she said. "I have been in love with you since December," he said. "I was not going to rush you or press you or make it anything other than what you were ready for it to be. But I want you to know it's true." She looked at him. The warm March morning all around them, the smell of turned earth, the first suggestion of everything beginning again. "I know," she said. "I know, and she stopped and started again. "I'm not done grieving. I want you to know that. I think grief is not something you finish like a task. I think it becomes a part of you, and I am not pretending it isn't there." "I don't want you to pretend," he said. "I want you to be exactly who you are." She reached across the step and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the first warm sun of the year and the garden dark and ready before them. The spring that followed was the best season Della had experienced on the homestead since before Thomas's illness, and she understood that this was partly because of the weather and partly because of the work, and partly because she was no longer alone in the particular way she had been alone before. She and Peter were not in a hurry about the shape of things. They had both lived enough to know that the shape of things mattered less than the substance of them, and the substance between them was solid and real, and did not require any particular rush to confirm. He rode over every morning for an hour before his own work began, and they drank coffee and made plans for the day. And in the evenings he came for supper 3 or 4 times a week, and on Sundays they went to church together and were not subtle about it, which Caldwell took in stride because Caldwell had always understood the arithmetic of the frontier. A widow with land and a capable man with a good heart were a natural conjunction, and if anyone had reservations they kept them to themselves. Margaret Olson at the general store said to Della one Saturday afternoon in April, with the air of someone who has been waiting to say something for some time, that Peter Wallace is a very decent man. "He is," Della said, sorting through bolts of cotton. "You look different," Margaret said. "I don't mean different in a bad way. I mean you look like you again." Della looked at her. "What do I look like when I'm not like myself?" "Like a lamp with the wick turned way down," Margaret said. "Like you're here but you're not using all the light." Della thought about this on the way home and decided it was an accurate description and that she was grateful to be described otherwise. She wrote to Ruth in April and told her about Peter, plainly and in full. She said that she was not replacing Thomas and that she did not think of it that way and that she believed Ruth would understand this. She said that Peter was a good man and that she was happy in a way that no longer felt like a betrayal and that she had finally said Thomas's name aloud and that it had helped. Ruth's letter back arrived in May. 4 pages in her small, precise handwriting, and it was one of the finest letters Della had ever received. Ruth said that she had prayed for exactly this, for Della to find her way back to happiness without letting go of love, because those were not the same thing, and she had always known Della would understand the difference. She said that Thomas had loved Della more than he had loved anything, and that what he would have wanted for her was exactly this: a full life, a good man, a heart that was opened rather than sealed. She said she was coming in June, and she intended to meet Peter Wallace and make her own assessment. Della read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening and cried for a while, which was the right kind of crying, the kind that is not loss but release, not grief but gratitude for what has been and what is. Peter proposed in May, on a Saturday evening after supper, when the last of the day's light was going gold over the prairie, and the smell of the blooming volunteer grass was in the air. He did not make a ceremony of it, which was right for who they were. He said, sitting on the front steps in the evening warmth, "I want to marry you. I want to be your partner for every piece of this, the land, the work, the life. I want to be here." She said, "Yes, I want that too." He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring, a simple gold band, no stones, which was exactly right, and put it on her finger. And she looked at it in the last of the light and thought about hands and the things they build and the things they hold. They were married in June, on the 17th, at the church in Caldwell, with Ruth Thatcher in the front pew looking so precisely like Thomas around the eyes that Della had to breathe carefully when she saw her. The ceremony was small and honest and presided over by Reverend Hastings, who had known Della for several years, and who married them with the warm gravity of a man who understood that this was not simple and was therefore more meaningful. Ruth Thatcher stayed for 3 weeks. She and Peter took to each other with the pragmatic directness of two people who had the same important person at the center of their regard for Della, and though it was a complicated arrangement to navigate, they navigated it honestly. Ruth told Peter, on the second day of her visit, sitting in Della's kitchen while Della was at the barn, that Thomas had been her son, and she loved him and would always love him, and that she also was very glad that Della had found Peter, and that she did not require Peter to perform any particular kind of deference to Thomas's memory, but simply to love Della well. Peter said he intended to. Ruth looked at him for a long moment and said, "Good," in the same way that Amos Pickett had said it at Christmas, and that was the end of the conversation and the beginning of a genuine warmth between them that would hold for the rest of their lives. Della and Peter did not move into one property or the other immediately. They talked about it through the summer, the practical question of the two homesteads, 160 acres each if they were consolidated, which was a substantial piece of ground and more than enough to build something significant on. By August they had decided. They would keep both properties, work them as one operation, and build a proper addition onto the Thatcher house, which was the better built of the two and which sat on the better piece of ground. The Harmon house they would retain as a working property and eventually hire a hand to manage the cattle side from there. It was a good plan. Peter's strengths, the cattle and the mechanical sense and the physical construction work, complemented Della's, the farming precision and the financial management, and the deep knowledge of the specific land she had been working for years. They argued sometimes about the way a thing should be done, and they were both stubborn in their own ways and neither of them gave up ground easily. But they argued honestly and resolved things honestly, and the arguing was always about the problem and never about each other. By September of 1879, the combined operation was running more efficiently than either property had run independently, and the debt at the Caldwell Savings and Loan was paid off 3 months ahead of schedule, and Della sat with the paid receipt in her hand at the kitchen table and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing completed, a thing that had been pressing on her for years lifted cleanly away. Peter came in from the yard and she showed him the receipt and he said, "Well," and sat down and looked at it for a moment. "What are you going to do with the money you were paying on that?" "Build the addition," she said. He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." In October, a year after Peter had arrived in Caldwell on his tired roan horse and nearly walked into Della Thatcher on the steps of the general store, she told him that she was expecting a baby. She told him in the morning, before the day's work began, over coffee at the kitchen table. She said it plainly, because she was a plain-speaking woman, and then she watched his face. His face did something that she had not seen it do before. It went through several things quickly, a whole conversation happening in his expression over about 3 seconds. Surprise and then calculation, and then a kind of joy that he was not trying to manage or qualify, just simply there, present and full. "Are you well?" he said first, which she found she loved him for. "I'm well," she said. "I'm tired, but I'm well." He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his. I am so glad," he said, and the inadequacy of the words compared to what was in his face was so obvious and so honest that she laughed, which was not what she had expected to do, and he laughed too. The pregnancy was not easy. She was 32 now, and the frontier was not a gentle place to be with child, and the winter was hard again, though not as brutal as the one before. She kept working because stopping working was not in her nature, but she was judicious about what she took on, and Peter was vigilant in the way that people are vigilant about things that matter most to them. He learned to read the particular quality of her silence that meant she was too tired, as distinct from the ordinary silence of a woman who is simply thinking, and he would quietly take over whatever she was doing or bring her inside to sit down, and he did this without making her feel managed, which was a skill. She thought about Thomas sometimes, during this period, with a tenderness that was clean of the locked grief. She thought about what he would have said and what he would have done and who he would have been as a father, and she let herself think it without putting it away, and it was sad in the way that beautiful things that are gone are sad, not annihilating but real. She told Peter about this one evening in the direct way she had come to tell him most things. "I think about him when I think about the baby," she said. "I want you to know that, and I want you to know it doesn't take anything from you." "I know that," he said. "I don't need you to unknow the people you've loved." She looked at him. He was mending a harness in the lamplight, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it his whole life, and he looked up and met her gaze with that steady, direct warmth that she had first noticed on the steps of the general store and had been learning the depth of ever since. "You're a good man," she said. "I'm working at it," he said. Their son was born on the 16th of March, 1880, a Sunday morning which Reverend Hastings later called a good omen, though Della was not much for omens. The birth was hard and long but ended well, with the help of the midwife, Mrs. Cora Simmons, who had delivered most of the children on Elm Creek Road, and was as good at her work as anyone Della had ever seen. Peter was in the barn for the worst of it because Mrs. Simmons had told him to be, and he came in when it was over and stood at the door of the bedroom with his hat in his hands and his face raw from the cold and the worry, and Della held up the baby and said, "Come and meet your son." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held the child with the careful, slightly terrified attention of a man holding a newborn for the first time, and he looked at the small face for a long time without saying anything. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. He looked at her. "What do you want to call him?" "I had a thought," she said, "if you agree. I thought James Thomas Wallace, James for your brother, Thomas for—" She stopped and then said it clearly, "Thomas, because he was a part of how we got here." Peter looked at the baby for a moment with his throat working. "James Thomas," he said. "Yes, that's right." Ruth Thatcher, when she got the letter with the news, wrote back by return mail with a warmth that came off the page like heat from a stove. She said she would come in the summer to meet her grandson, and she did, arriving in July with a trunk full of things she had been knitting since October when Della had written to tell her the news. She held James Thomas for most of the first 2 days of her visit and watched Peter with the sharp, loving attention of a woman, assessing the quality of care being given to something precious. On the 3rd day of her visit, she found Peter at the addition he was building on the back of the house, measuring boards with the focused competence that he brought to construction work, and she stood watching him for a moment and then said, "You're building it very solid." "It needs to last," he said. "Yes," she said, "it does, and then my son would have liked you." Peter set down his measuring line. "I'm told that," he said carefully. "It's true," Ruth said. "He was a practical man and a kind one, and he liked people who were both." She looked at the addition, at the careful frame of it. He would have wanted this for her, a good man who builds solid, don't you doubt that? I don't, Peter said after a moment. I try not to. Ruth nodded, satisfied, and went back inside to James Thomas, and that conversation was never revisited because it did not need to be. The years that followed were full and purposeful and marked by the natural rhythm of a life built on good ground. The operation on Elm Creek Road grew steadily, and they added acreage when the neighboring property came up for sale in 1882. Took on two hands to manage the expanding cattle work, experimented with wheat, and found a combination of winter and spring varieties that yielded reliably in the Kansas conditions. The debt was gone and stayed gone, and they saved carefully and spent carefully and made choices with the long view that comes from people who know what it is to build something from very little. James Thomas learned to walk in the kitchen of the expanded house in the summer of 1881, hauling himself up on the table legs and Della's skirts and Peter's outstretched hands, and he was a determined child with his mother's gray eyes and his father's particular way of looking at a problem, as though it had a rule he was trying to identify. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter they called Margaret Ruth, Margaret for the woman at the general store who had been a quiet friend through all of it, Ruth for the grandmother who had written letters every 2 weeks and never once lost faith. Margaret Ruth was a different nature from her brother, louder, faster to laugh, with a boldness that made Della think sometimes, with a smile, of no one in particular and everyone at once. The homestead was a home in the full sense of the word now, not just a working property managed by a woman alone against the difficulty of things, but a place where two people had put themselves together and built something that was more than the sum of the parts. There was a good kitchen with a proper range that Peter had installed in the second year. There was a library shelf in the front room with a genuine collection of books. There was a vegetable garden that was the envy of the neighbors and a chicken yard, and a well-maintained barn that still showed the particular quality of the hands that had first raised it. The town of Caldwell grew around them, as frontier towns do. The railroad came through in 1880, which changed the character of the cattle trade and changed the character of the town, bringing more permanent settlers and a more settled air. The wild edge of it, the real frontier quality, softened over those years. The Indian Territory to the south was pressed and constrained in ways that were unjust. Della was not ignorant of this, could not be, living on the border as she did. And she felt the weight of it, the knowledge that the homesteads and the towns and the whole enterprise of settlement came at a cost borne by people who had not consented to bear it. She talked to her children about this honestly, when they were old enough, because she believed that the land deserved an honest accounting. Peter, who had spent time enough near the territory in his Texas years to know more than most settlers about the Comanche and the other nations who had been displaced, agreed with her. It was one of the things they had in common, the unwillingness to look away from uncomfortable truths about the place they inhabited. They could not change the shape of history, but they could raise children who understood it, and they tried to. The autumn of 1884 was a golden one, warm and long and generous in the way that good seasons sometimes are, as though the year is making a gift of itself before the close. The harvest was the best in several years. The cattle prices were up, and James Thomas, who was 4 years old and extremely interested in the mechanics of the corn sheller, spent most of October following Peter around the farm in a miniature version of his father's canvas duster that Della had made from a remnant, asking questions in a steady stream that Peter answered with the same patient attentiveness he brought to everything. One Saturday afternoon in October, with the last of the harvest in the barn and the light coming down through the turning cottonwood leaves in long golden columns, Della sat on the front steps with Margaret Ruth asleep in her lap and James Thomas playing in the yard, and Peter coming up from the barn with the end-of-day look about him that she knew and loved, satisfied and tired and present. He sat down beside her on the steps. He took off his hat and looked out over the yard and the fence and the grass going gold, and she leaned her shoulder into his because it was the natural thing, the easy thing, the thing she had been doing for years. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the question he asked occasionally, not because he doubted the answer but because he believed it was important to ask. She looked at her son in the yard, intent on something in the dirt. She looked at the sleeping weight of her daughter. She looked at the barn with its solid walls and the house at her back with its warm kitchen and its shelf of books. She looked at the man beside her, at the familiar lines of his face and the strong curve of his hands, and the way he was looking at everything she was looking at with the same careful love. "Yes," she said, "I am." He put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and the afternoon light held them for a long time, warm and still and full, and overhead the cottonwood leaves turned in the easy wind and came down one at a time like small bright gifts from the season. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him with the love that does not go away when you lay a name down, the love that lives in the land and the cooking and the letters from Ohio, and the way she still sometimes heard his particular dry humor in her own voice when she said something he might have said. She thought about the locked place in her chest that had been open for 6 years now, and how the opening of it had not meant loss but had meant, instead, the possibility of everything that had come after. The garden, the children, the years on Elm Creek Road, this man. She had carried the name like a stone, and then she had set it down, and what she had found on the other side of setting it down was not the absence she had feared but presence, the full, breathing, alive presence of her own life, still going, still good, still capable of love in all the forms that love takes when it is given room to grow. Ruth Thatcher came every summer until she was too old to travel, which was 1886, and then she wrote even more faithfully than before, and her letters were the treasure. Della kept them in the box with all the others, and James Thomas and Margaret Ruth knew their grandmother Ruth through those letters and through the stories Della told, and they knew that their grandmother Ruth had loved a man named Thomas who had been good and kind and built the barn, and that he had been a part of how everything had come to be the way it was, and they understood this with the uncomplicated acceptance of children who have been given an honest account of the world. When James Thomas was old enough to ask, which was when he was about 7, he asked his mother whether she had loved his father before she loved Papa Peter. She told him yes, very much, and that loving the first person had not stopped her from loving the second, and that the heart was larger than people sometimes thought. He accepted this with the same methodical interest with which he accepted most information, and went back to whatever he had been doing. Margaret Ruth, at the same age, asked Peter whether he had been afraid to love her mother because someone had loved her before. Peter thought about it carefully, which was how he thought about things that mattered, and said that he had not been afraid of that, but that he had been careful, because Della was a person worth being careful about. Margaret Ruth said, "Good," in a tone that was so precisely her grandmother Ruth's tone that Peter laughed out loud, which startled her and then made her laugh too. The last decade of the 19th century brought change to the territory and to Kansas and to Caldwell as it brought change everywhere. The frontier, the real open frontier, was closing, documented officially and inescapably by the 1890 census, which declared the frontier line as effectively ceased. The cattle drive era was over, replaced by the rail-shipped cattle and the barbed wire fencing that divided what had been open range into parcels, and the towns along the old trail routes had to find new reasons for themselves or fade. Caldwell found its reasons in the farming economy that had been growing alongside the cattle trade all along, and it did not fade. The Thatcher Wallace operation, which is how it was known on Elm Creek Road, and eventually by the Caldwell Savings and Loan, where they kept a substantial deposit by 1890, was one of the most well-regarded farms in Sumner County. They had 320 acres by then, the consolidated homesteads and the additional parcel, a beef cattle operation managed from the old Harmon house, and a mixed grain and vegetable farm that supplied the Caldwell market every Saturday. They were known for honest dealing and good product, and for being people you could count on when something went wrong on the road. Peter was 51 in 1896 and Della was 49, and their bodies carried the honest record of 20 years of outdoor work, but they were healthy and strong and no less themselves for any of it. James Thomas was 16 and had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and a mind that Peter was determined to see educated beyond what the local school could offer. There were college programs in Lawrence and in Manhattan, Kansas, that were accessible and practical, and Peter had been setting money aside for several years with this in mind. Margaret Ruth was 14 and had made it thoroughly clear that she intended to be a doctor, which Della thought was possible and Peter thought might require a significant fight with the world, and both of them had told her so, and she had received this information with the calm certainty of someone who has already decided that a fight with the world is not a deterrent. Della recognized this quality and was deeply proud of it, even when it was directed at her. On the evening of their 17th wedding anniversary, in June of 1896, Peter made supper himself. He had become a genuinely good cook over the years, the biscuit lesson having opened a door he had walked through with increasing enthusiasm. And they ate on the front porch in the warm evening because the kitchen was still holding the day's heat, and the children were elsewhere. James Thomas at the Barlow farm helping with a mechanical problem and Margaret Ruth at a study group in town. And it was just the two of them in the long summer evening. He had put wildflowers on the table. Prairie wildflowers, the ones that came up along the creek road every June, the purple and yellow ones whose names Della could never quite remember but whose faces she had known since the first spring on the homestead. Simple and local and exactly right. 17 years, she said. I know, he said. I was thinking today, she said, about the day you arrived. I remember seeing you come into town on that horse and I thought that man has had a hard few weeks. He laughed. The horse had had a harder time than I had. I nearly walked into you on the store steps. You nearly walked into me, he said, correcting the version she had not corrected in October of 1878. I was in your way. We were in each other's way, she said. We were, he agreed. I don't mind. She reached across the table and took his hand, the way she had taken it on the front steps in March of 1879 with the spring sun warm and the garden dark and ready before them. His hand was different now, more weathered, the knuckles more prominent, the skin drier from all the years of outdoor work, and the same, entirely the same in what it communicated when it held hers. I love you, she said. I want you to know I am aware of it every day. He looked at her with those walnut-brown eyes, 17 years older and not different in any way that mattered. I know, he said. I am too. The evening settled around them, the creek road quiet, the grass going dark and the first stars coming up over the Kansas sky, and the homestead breathed and held them. The house that Thomas had built and Peter had expanded, the barn that Thomas had raised and Peter had repaired, and James Thomas would one day inherit, the garden that Della had kept through every difficult season, the land that had asked of her everything she had and had given back more than she had known to ask for. The name that had been locked in her chest for 14 months and then released on a March morning to a man who had been willing to hear it, that name was at peace now, not gone, not forgotten. Present the way the things that have shaped us are present in the grain of the wood, and the lines of the face and the love we learn from loss and carry forward into everything that comes after. Della Thatcher, who had become Della Wallace in the church in Caldwell in June of 1879, held her husband's hand in the dusk of their 17th anniversary and watched the stars come out over the prairie and was, fully and without complication, at home, not just in the house, in her life. In the particular shape of the life she had built from what grief had left her, and what love had made possible, and what her own stubborn, precise, honest heart had understood in the end, was still worth the work. The last of the wildflowers on the table held their color against the going dark, and the creek road was still, And James Thomas would come home later with news about the mechanical problem he had solved. And Margaret Ruth would come home with a borrowed medical text she was not supposed to have read yet but had read straight through. And Peter would make coffee and Della would find a plate of something for them all. And the kitchen would be warm and full of voices. And this ordinary, complete, full thing was the whole of what she had wanted and more than she had known how to ask for in the 14 months when she had kept a name locked inside herself like a letter that could not be sent. She had sent it. She had said it. She had let it go. And in letting it go, she had let herself back into everything.